There's some lens flare, but I'm gonna roll with it. A Dance with Dragons, Davos II. There were other places he might get his ears filled. An inn famous for its lamprey pies. The alehouse where the wool factors and the customs men did their drinking. A mummer's hall where bawdy entertainments could be had for a few pennies. But Davos felt that he had heard enough. I've come too late. Old instinct made him reach for his chest, where once he'd kept his finger bones in a little sack on a leather thong. There was nothing there. He had lost his luck in the fires of the Blackwater, when he'd lost his ship and sons. What must I do now? He pulled his mantle tighter. Do I climb the hill and present myself at the gates of the new castle, to make a futile plea? Return to Sisterton, make my way back to Maria and my boys, buy a horse and ride the King's Road, to tell Stannis that he has no friends in White Harbor, and no hope. Queen Selyse had feasted Sala and his captains, the night before the fleet had set sail. Cotter Pike had joined them, and 4 other high officers of the Night's Watch. Princess Shireen had been allowed to attend as well. As the salmon was being served, Sir Axel Florent had entertained the table with the tale of a Targaryen princeling who kept an ape as a pet. This prince liked to dress the creature in his dead son's clothes and pretend he was a child, Sir Axel claimed, and from time to time he would propose marriages for him. The lords so honored always declined politely, but of course they did decline. Even dressed in silk and velvet, an ape remains an ape, Sir Axel said. A wiser prince would have known that you cannot send an ape to do a man's work. The Queen's men laughed, and several grinned at Davos. I am no ape, he thought. I am as much a lord as you, and a better man. But the memory still stung. Davos has been sent to White Harbor by Stannis to find friends for Stannis in his cause, his pursuit for the Iron Throne. And Queen Selyse throws a feast for Salador San and his captains, and Axel Florent is there, and Davos is there, and Shireen is even there. Sir Axel tells a story about a prince who kept an ape as a pet. He dressed it in his dead son's clothes and pretended it was a child, and from time to time would propose marriages for him. It's a funny story, but it kind of makes you wonder if it wasn't so funny in reality. It sounds a lot like the father might have been driven mad with grief for the death of his son. And now he's got this ape that he's using as a surrogate son to cope with the grief. And because he's a prince, everybody's afraid to tell him he can't do that. Now, it isn't certain that that's what's going on. It could just be that the prince is having a laugh. But the prince is having a laugh interpretation kind of falls apart when you think about it. Hardly anybody would profane the memory of their dead child by putting his clothes on an ape and then pretending that the ape is that child. So the mad with grief interpretation actually makes more sense, and that's probably what really happened. It says, this prince liked to dress the creature in his dead son's clothes. Even the lords declining politely aligns with that, because if it were a joke, they probably wouldn't be so concerned with being polite to the prince. They would just say, no, not happening. They might make some rude jokes right back and play along with the joke and make it funnier. So it seems like even the parent lords of the people, the women to whom the prince is proposing marriage with his ape son, are aware that the prince is mad with grief too, and they're tiptoeing around his sensitivity. Sir Axel Florent is obviously using the story to publicly humiliate Davos, because Davos is at a feast with a bunch of highborn people, and he was only recently promoted to Lord, and so he's kind of an outsider. He doesn't feel like he belongs. They feel like he doesn't belong. They all kind of resent his presence a bit. But as Davos says in his thoughts, I am as much a lord as you. So Davos does technically have a right to be there. But there's nothing any of them can do about it, because he's one of Stannis' trusted advisors, and he's been promoted to lord. So since they can't get rid of them, they're just going to make fun of him and make him feel unwelcome. With stories like this. We could stop analyzing this part of the text now, and it would be a good analysis as it is. Or we could try to extract some rules of engagement that this passage might be conveying for the story, the greater Song of Ice and Fire story as a whole. So let's do that. I think this passage is a demonstration of how a person can do story interpretation wrong. In this case, the person is Axel Florent. He's interpreting his own story wrong, which is funny because it's his story. I mean, he probably heard it from someone else, but at least in the context of this feast, it's his story. He's the one telling it. Axel summarizes the story in 2 lines. He says, "Even dressed in silk and velvet, an ape remains an ape," Sir Axel said. "A wiser prince would have known that you cannot send an ape to do a man's work." He's framing the story as though the prince was sending the ape to do a man's work. But that isn't really what the prince was doing at all. The prince was trying to attract human women to the ape, proposing a marriage between them. So with Axel's comment, Axel may be exposing in himself a pretty gross view of marriage. There are 2 meanings of the word man. One means human, and the other means male human. If he means all humans, then it's not so bad. But if he means male humans, then the quote-unquote man's work that he's describing is the sex in the marriage, rather than the marriage itself. So Axel might view marriage exclusively in terms of sex. Sex is important, but it's a bit reductive. So the first line of Sir Axel's summary of this story is absolutely right. That's a valid and meaningful takeaway from that story. But the second part of his summary is absolutely wrong. He says a wiser prince would have known that you cannot send an ape to do a man's work. But that isn't actually what was happening in the story. So Sir Axel doesn't seem to understand his own story. But the Queen's men laugh anyway, and Davos feels embarrassed anyway. And Sir Axel probably feels like he got one over on Davos anyway. Davos thinks, but the memory still stung. So the second part of Axel's summary of the story is contrived, specifically for the purpose of insulting and humiliating Davos. So the summary is motivated by something other than a desire to understand the story. It's socially motivated. There's this class difference happening between the people at the feast and Davos, and they're resentful of Davos for it, so Axel's making fun of him and they're all laughing about it because they tend to agree with Axel's attitude that Davos doesn't really belong there, even though he technically does as a new-made lord. So Axel's misunderstanding of his own story partly comes from the fact that Axel didn't do a good enough job of putting himself in the shoes of the princeling in the story. Axel either thinks, or he's pretending to think, that the prince in the story is just having a laugh with the ape. He doesn't realize this is a really sad situation of a parent's grief and the death of a child. And the prince having so much power as a prince that the other lords are afraid to say anything against his delusional coping mechanism here. Axel says a wiser prince would have known that you cannot send an ape to do a man's work. So he frames it as an issue of wisdom, like the prince just wasn't wise enough to know that an ape is not a human, or that humans won't want to marry an ape. It's like, no, this is not an issue of wisdom, Axel. This is an issue of grief and power and a relationship between them that is only funny in retrospect. It's probably not funny for the people it was happening to. So maybe one rule of engagement for A Song of Ice and Fire that we can extract from this passage is that we need to do a better job of putting ourselves in the shoes of the characters in the story and seeing things the way that they see it. Or else we might end up looking like an asshole, like Sir Axel Florent. And another rule of engagement for A Song of Ice and Fire that we might extract from this passage is that we should be careful not to let our reasoning be motivated by forces other than a simple desire to understand the story in the context of itself. Because Sir Axel was motivated by social forces. He wanted to get one over on Davos and reap the rewards of having done that in front of everybody. And he did. But as Davos says quietly in his own thoughts, I am as much a lord as you, and a better man. In the end, I think Lord Davos is going to have the last laugh.